Good morning. As Governor Deal stated, Georgia faces an economic development imperative when it comes to college completion and drastically increasing the number of students and number of young Georgians that hold a post-secondary credential. Given this view of this problem, I'm very glad that we have Chris Clark, the CEO and president of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, here with us today to talk about the workforce connection in this issue. Since taking the helm of the Georgia Chamber in November of 2010, Chris has looked at how the Chamber can be a force to improve Georgia's business climate, promote innovation and technology, encourage economic growth, and of course, focus on the reason why we're all here today, education and workforce development. Please join me in welcoming the President and CEO of the Georgia Chamber, Chris Clark.
Well, good morning.
Hey.
Oh, really? One more time. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, thank you all, Chancellor. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for giving me the opportunity to come over here this morning and just spend a few minutes with you and to introduce our next guest. Let me just be quite frank with you. I'm here this morning because what you're working on is very, very important. As a matter of fact, as I look around the room today, I see many of my peers and colleagues from chambers all over the state and from economic developers all over the state. As a matter of fact, I know they're here too because it's important to them and their communities. If you're with a local chamber or if you do economic development for a living, would you stand up? David, I know you're here, and Nathan and Don and all. Would y'all join me in thanking them for taking the time to be with y'all this morning too? This issue of job creation is important not just in Georgia and in all their communities, but it's important in the world. I want to share with you a paragraph from a book that I'm really obsessed with right now. If you haven't read this book yet, it's called The Coming Jobs War. Who here has read this? You get an A, everybody else not good. I think it's probably the most influential book on economic development since Richard Florida's Rise of the Creative Class. If you haven't read it yet, again, it's called The Coming Jobs War. And it was really done based upon a lot of work by Gallup. And what it said was, for the first time in the history of the world, the number one most important thing to every human age 15 and up wasn't love or happiness or shelter. It was finding a good quality job. The number one issue in the world. And to underline that and to tell you why it's important at the global level, listen to the statistics here. Of the 7 billion people on earth, there are 5 billion adults aged 15 and older. Of these 5 billion, 3 billion tell Gallup that they want to work. Now, most of these people want a full-time formal job. The problem is that there are currently only 1.2 billion full-time formal jobs in the world. This is potentially devastating global shortfall of about 1.8 billion good jobs. So what's a good job? Well, a good job is pretty simple. It's 30-plus hours of work a week. It's not a certain salary. It's not a certain type of job. It's that I can work at least 30 hours a week to take care of my family. There are folks around the world who are doing everything they can, and they want to have that good job. Well, in my job, I get to work with economic developers and site selection consultants and job creators every day. And guess what, y'all? They're looking for good folks. It's the number one issue for them, and so somewhere there's a disconnect there, and I think the work that you're doing in Georgia will help bridge that disconnect. Now, when we're talking to economic developers or site selection folks, when we're talking to companies all over Georgia, as I do every day, I have stories about the importance of the work that y'all do. Whether we're taking a survey, whether we're doing research, whether we're doing a town hall meeting with Governor Deal, workforce and education are the drivers, not just today, but what all of business folks think is going to be the driver of our economy in Georgia and in the Southeast and the world for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And I could give story after story after story. It doesn't matter what sector we're in. When I talk to folks in agribusiness and farmers around the state, it's the work that they do through the Department of, or the College of Agriculture here, or the work that they do with David Bridges folks in Tifton that make the difference of whether or not they're successful. I talk to retailers who tell me they can't find enough folks to come in and work because they don't have the right work ethic. That's a shame at the end of the day. I talk to manufacturers who tell me the outreach work that Georgia Tech does is the difference maker for them transitioning from the old economy to the new economy and being able to continue to be successful. I talk to prospects who choose other states because they don't have the confidence in our STEM system and our STEM pipeline in Georgia. When I talk to local chamber presidents and we talk about who's the most important person for the long-term economy of your community, you know what they tell us? It's the superintendent, it's the technical college president, it's the university president. They're the ones that are going to make the difference in those communities. And I even get to work with military commanders who tell us that the ability of that base in Georgia to be successful and to defend this country and to continue to be an economic engine is reliant upon the relationship that they have outside the gate with that local technical college. Y'all can probably relate these same stories on and on and on and on. The connection there is very easy to see. Well, that's why our organization at the Georgia Chamber and why business organizations across this state in the last few years have made a renewed commitment to be a partner in education, to take on whatever the challenge is with you because we realize that it's all interconnected and you don't have to do it on your own and we can't figure it out on our own. And so just in the last few months at the Georgia Chamber alone, and Ryan Mahoney is with us. He focuses on education for us, and Steve Dolinger runs the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education. We're working on a variety of things. We're proud to be working with the superintendent right now on a career path initiative. We've got over 4,000 HR directors from around the state that are working on our high school curriculum. We've been working with the Gates Foundation on how we finance K-12 education in Georgia. We're proud to work with Tricia Pridemore and the commissioner on Go Build Georgia, and we want to be a partner on Complete College. It is valuable, it's critical for every corner of the state of Georgia. Now, a lot of what we can do is help you get the right data, to find the right path forward, to bring the right resources to bear. Whatever the issue is for you, as you deal with these issues, know that it's important to the business community, and we're willing and ready to be your partner. And next time someone stands up here and says, if you're involved at the local chamber or if you're in economic development, I would suggest that every person in this room ought to stand up, because you are all economic developers in some way, and I appreciate what you do every day. The work that you're doing is important. That's why I wanted to come today and introduce your final speaker. It's Dr. Nicole Smith. She's a research professor and a senior economist at Georgetown University Center on Education and Workforce. She's studying and developing the data to connect what you're doing back with what we need as the end users over the long term. Now, before coming to Georgetown, she was a member of the faculty at Gettysburg College and at the University of West Indies. She's a native of Trinidad and Tobago. She received her bachelor's degree and master's degree from the University of West Indies and her PhD in economics from the American University in Washington. Would you join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Nicole Smith?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I would like to first start by thanking Commissioner Jackson and Chancellor Huckabee, and especially thanking Linda Noble for making the initial connection so that I can be here today. Now, I know that Jim, when he was up here a moment ago, said that it's good to either be first or last when you're given these types of discussions. I'm not exactly sure if I want to be last, though, because my last is also the person who's standing between you and lunch. So if there are 400 people in the room and I'm last, I know it can get a little bit hairy. But I promise to try to stick to the point. And I also have 20/20 vision. I really just wear these glasses for the glare. So if there's anyone here that's falling asleep, I'm going to actually point you out. So... So I encourage you to pay attention, because I also ask questions. I've been teaching for quite some time as well. So The beginning of this discussion, this morning's discussion, we started off with Stan Jones and with Jim Applegate, and their focus was essentially on, now let me just make sure I can actually start. Am I going the wrong way? I'm going the right way. Oh. Their discussion was actually focused on supply. So, how best do we graduate the number of graduates that we need? How best do we attain our goals? How best do we get to the 250,000 number goal by 2020? How best do we get to Lumina's 2025 goal? And my job today is to talk a little bit about demand. So my side of the game is, well, okay, once we graduate all of these people, where do they go? Where are the jobs? Do the jobs exist? I can't tell you how many meetings that I've been to where, a lot of people are so focused on what's happening today that it's hard to get your head up from, out of the sand and look into the future. Most people think, well, we've lost over 8 million jobs in this recession. The jobs aren't coming back. And part of the story is, well, they are coming back. They're coming back much more slowly than we would have hoped. Right now, we're averaging about 140,000 jobs per month, creating about 140,000 jobs per month. But what's important for us to do is to look at, trends and to see what's been happening over time. What's noticeable in the trends is that the jobs that come back, the jobs that replace the ones that are gone, don't look very much like the ones that were gone. In fact, the jobs that are coming back require more and more post-secondary education and training. There's lots of talk of this man session. Everyone's heard about the man session, right? Have you heard of the man session? The man session is the recession that seemed to be focused so much on men. We lost jobs in construction. We lost jobs in finance. We lost jobs in sectors that were male-dominated. So there's this notion that it's the man session. And with this talk about the man session, this preoccupation with how many men have lost jobs, we almost forget that the education distribution of the jobs are also tell a story, also paint a picture. And what you find is that a lot of the jobs that are lost were low education jobs, and this is really one of the charts that Jim had showed earlier. A lot of the jobs that lost were jobs that required less than a high school diploma or a high school diploma. And in construction, mostly in construction industry, some of them in manufacturing. The ones that were replaced were in healthcare and in education and in STEM. And many of those jobs required post-secondary certificate or certification, something beyond the high school. So let's look at some pictures that tell us the story. So this is one of my favorite charts to show. It basically shows us for the prime age workers in America, what the education distribution of the workers were in 1973 all the way to 1992, 2010, and our forecast for 2020. And if you can't see these numbers, then I just encourage you to look at the color scheme, where blue means post-secondary, so blue is post-high school. And if you look at the first column of blue, that's 28% in 1973, and as you go to the right, you notice that the blue section is getting larger and larger and larger. More and more jobs, more and more of our jobs require post-secondary education and training. Now, this is not a coincidence. I mean, a lot of people, who give you the impression that, it's just chambers of commerce and managers buying degrees. Well, it's a little bit more than that. Employers are not willing to pay for what they can get for free. So if employers are paying an extra amount of money for this degree, then this suggests that there's some value to this degree. This suggests that there's some sort of value to this extra certification. And what we found is that the premium, the wage premium to holders of post-secondary education and training is in the vicinity of about 74%. So if you have some type of post-secondary education beyond high school, you earn 74% more than the person who has only a high school diploma. What this also means, this chart also shows, is there is this skills bias technological change, meaning that most of the jobs of the future are now requiring more and more post-secondary education. And the real example I like to use, because people can take home more from a story when they get examples, is when I was a teenager and I got my first car. The job of a mechanic, a mechanic is a mechanic, right? A mechanic is a person who fixes cars and fixes automobiles. That type of job existed in the 70s and the 80s and the 60s, way before. But if we look at the education requirement of the mechanic now, it's very different today than it was in the past. It's the same job that now requires more and more education. And the example I love to give is that whenever my car would shut down, my father would pop the hood and he would dust out the battery pole and spray it with some white solution. I'm thinking it's just baking soda. I'm not certain, but he would dust it off with this iron brush, and we would start the car, and it would work. We would start again, and I can go to the beach or whatever I was doing at that time instead of going to class. But whenever my check engine light comes on now for my car, I need to take it to the shop, and believe you me, before I even say what's wrong, it's $1,000 because they have to connect it to a computer. And now the mechanic is trained to read the code and to understand what the code means, the very same job of a mechanic. So inherent in progress is this bias towards more skill, this bias towards more education. Our jobs are requiring more education in the future. Well, what does this result in? This has resulted in a new type of worker. And I'm stealing the phrase, the T student, from an IBM person that I'd met in a meeting a few months ago. And this T student has broad knowledge in various areas of discipline, but deep knowledge in his own particular field. And this is what allows you to be able to connect in the 21st century job. I mean, you have to have the knowledge, the skills, the abilities, the interests, the values, and the personality now to be able to survive in this 21st century job, workplace. When we think of what's required, I think Chris initially started talking about workers not having the appropriate demeanor for jobs. Employers complaining that soft skills are the skills that are most hard to come by. Part of it has to do with exactly what type of training that we're obtaining in the colleges and universities. Whenever I have this conversation, or I try to have this conversation about connecting education to workforce, I have to thread lightly, especially when there's a room full of educators. And I'll tell you why. I would start off by saying that we all know that education has much greater roles than just preparing people for the workforce. I start off by saying that education, there's all the social reasons for education. We're trying to create good citizens. We want to make sure that people are very well educated for life and all of those wonderful things. And even though I start off saying that, and then I get into the nitty-gritty of workforce, I get all the rolling of the eyes and I get the question, are we then creating, the foot soldiers of capitalism? No, we're not. But it's also important, it's really important, particularly in this environment, for us to pay attention to workforce. We have to pay attention to the demands of the economy. Jim threw up a slide which side by side showed many of the states in terms of our attainment, compared it to attainment for the rest of the world. We are competing globally. Whether we recognize it or not, we are competing globally for jobs, we are competing globally for opportunity. Every year, we train thousands of students from around the world in STEM. We train students in healthcare. We train students around the world. And by the time they graduate, after about 12 months of OPT, optional practical training, they return to their countries. And then they are trained at the best of our institutions to do what we have been doing as well, to probably sometimes do it even better. So the issue we have here is we need to make sure that once we graduate our students, that our students are prepared for the jobs of the future. Our students know what types of workforce they should expect, what types of abilities they need to be successful once they graduate. So what are the priors? What's our real world? Well, today, in our real world, we have side by side with unemployment, we have job vacancies. 12 million Americans unemployed, but in his convention speech, Bill Clinton raised the point that there were about 3 million jobs that go unfilled. So how do you reconcile this? How do we have jobs that continuously go unfilled existing side by side with the unemployed? There's a figure from the Manufacturing Association which says that 600,000 manufacturing jobs are going unfilled. And their rationale is that there's a skills shortage. If this is true, and we have to believe the data, then the question is, what are we doing to fill those gaps? We are graduating students, as Stan pointed out, not nearly enough and not nearly in a timely fashion as we ought to, but we're graduating many of these students who, once they leave, do not possess the skills, the knowledge, the abilities, the values, and the interest to do the jobs that exist. So there is a disconnect. And we need to find some way of better connecting what happens in the institutions such as ours, in the tertiary institutions that are producing the supply, what happens to demand in the workforce. Soft skills, communication, networking, people skills have grown in importance but remain insufficient. We need to ensure that primary, secondary, tertiary workforce training no longer exist in distinct silos. So we need better connectivity in order to be successful. So which comes first? Well, this morning, Commissioner Jackson and Chancellor Huckabee were talking about trying to find ways of ensuring that we get to the 250,000 goal. And it is every governor's goal or every state's goal to ensure that its workforce is adequately trained. You have to make sure that your students are trained, your graduating class is trained. I mean, in reality, it's a little bit difficult to do that because we have so much fluidity across borders. We might have students from Tennessee who are going and coming. Fortunately, Georgia is a magnet state, so Georgia has the ability to pull in workers and to pull in students as well. But even from the governor's perspective, if his charge also, part of his charge is also to create jobs for those workers when they graduate, it's easier for him to do so when he can demonstrate a prepared workforce, when he can say, look, industry, this particular industry, you can come here because we already have the trained workforce to do so. It's extremely difficult for you to encourage industry to settle in a particular area when they feel as if the workforce isn't prepared or they're going to have to train people and they're going to have to expend all this extra effort in doing so. So we have coexisting, which comes first? There's no real answer. We almost have to work at all of them together. We have to make sure that industry, workforce preparedness, and jobs all exist in tandem so that we can graduate students and institutions and that they are able to fulfill their dream. They're able to get a job once they graduate. We have insufficient access to data, inability to set data-driven goals. And we still have a somewhat weak economy, and I'm giving you an unemployment rate and GDP growth rate. We're still coming out of this recession that started in December of 2007, okay? When we look at the number of jobs that have been lost in this recession, and at its peak in February 2009, we lost over 900,000 jobs per month in February 2009. We've since recovered to about 140,000 on the positive side. But once you look at the number of jobs that have been lost, and you think of the incoming cohort, so we have to do two things. We have to recover those jobs that have been lost so that the people who are still on the sidelines waiting can get a job, and we all know about the long-term unemployed, defined as people who have been working out of work for more than 6 months. We have to give them a job, and we have to create new jobs for the incoming cohort. So 140,000 per month really is not enough. So it's still too slow, and in fact, by our estimates, we don't recover jobs lost and create enough jobs to mop up the incoming cohort until 2017. So it's a slow and steady slug to the finish line. It's just slow and steady, but we're getting there. In terms of jobs, in terms of connecting to workforce, this is just a lot of words, but I'll tell you what it says. There was a lot of money in the stimulus package that proposed that we connect to workforce. We connect post-secondary to workforce. I know for a fact that Tennessee has done so successfully all the way from K-12 all the way through to the workforce. They're able to connect. We can trace back using in Tennessee information. We can trace an individual to figure out, well, what types of transcripts, what your transcript look like, what types of wages you now earn, so we can tell you the connection between the type of degree you do and your potential, your income and earnings potential. I wanted to give some Georgia specific data and to make a shameless plug for a report that should be available. I think I had shipped it a few months earlier through Linda. Linda was actually one of the co-authors of the report. But what we did in this particular report is we looked at industry for many states in the South, including Georgia, and we looked at industry profile, industry growth, a specific in-depth analysis of which industries are forecast to grow. And then we worked backwards to fit the occupations within those industries. So once you've defined the industry profile and you've forecast that, what's the occupational mix that satisfies that industry growth? And then the education distribution. And the reason that we're doing all of this is, look, as educators, and if we believe that one of the reasons that we're training our students is so that they can get good jobs, we need to tell them where. We need to be able to tell them where, which occupations, which locations. There's no real crystal ball. We're all based on historical data, on governor's speeches, on Chamber of Commerce reviews on where they're going to invest next. It's all a sort of art more than a science, but at the end of the day, it's better than nothing. We need to be able to say, where are you going, what's the potential? This particular chart compares Georgia to some of the other states, southern states that are closest in location. And what we have here is a sort of distribution of demand by education level. So we come from some college, and that's the dubious some college, which includes post-secondary vocational certificates. So some of them are valuable, and some, you might have a certificate in there, a credential, but sometimes you just have some college credits and not necessarily a credential. So there's some college, AA degrees, bachelor's degrees, graduate degrees by state. DC, of course, is an anomaly. We can almost throw them out. They're too small anyway. But we have Georgia competing directly with Florida, Texas, in terms of the proportions of jobs that require post-secondary education and training. So what would we like? We would like information at the transcript level that will allow us to estimate the market value added per course. I want to know which courses add value. By my subjective definition of value, which has to do with your earnings potential. I know all about the other definitions of value, social value and all that. I want to talk about economic value. Are students working in their major? Why do I ask? Because we find that once students work in their major, they seem to make more money. They seem to earn more once you're in your major. If you're working in your major and you can get a job in your major, then you might have been able to, better assess ahead of time where shortages were so that you can get into there and get that job early on. We want to know the value of credentials so that we can better target outcomes. And here's a chart by Pat Kelly. I guess he's going to be speaking to you guys tomorrow, but I just love this chart. I always use it. And this chart shows you, it's first of all, it's BA degrees. So it's people with bachelor's degrees. And it's bachelor's degrees by major, so which majors you've chosen. And it's bachelor's degrees by majors by age. So it tells you a little bit about, people who just graduated, how much you can expect to earn, and what happens later on. And I tell you, this chart makes people really uncomfortable. Is anyone here uncomfortable? Because what you see in this chart is this, it's a value judgment on value. It says that STEM seems to, give you the most value for your money at the starting gate, followed closely by healthcare, business and communications, psychology, liberal arts, and education. And over time, and the reason it's important to do this by age is that over time, you have all the work experience and that sort of thing that bumps you up, that you get the additional work experience. This type of information people need to know. And this type of information is often withheld for all of the reasons that we've outlined before. The purpose of education has very little to do with just finding a job and earning an income. But I'll tell you what, since tuition over the last 5 or 6 years has risen at a faster rate than the rate of inflation, we know about gainful employment legislation. And gainful employment legislation really is an attempt by the education department to rein in the for-profit institutions, the for-profits that have used a lot of government funds to create programs, some of which are dead-end programs. Dead-end programs in the sense that the graduates from those programs are unable to parlay their degrees or their certificates or certifications in the marketplace so that they can repay their loans. If you can't repay your loan according to this gainful employment legislation, then you're not going to have access to government funds anymore. So what this means for for-profits, for-profits have come back at this with a vengeance. Because as you can imagine, it's really a threat to their own existence. But community colleges are also concerned. We spoke a little bit earlier about access and success. And Jim spoke about access and success. And whenever we talk about access, I start thinking about equity. Open enrollment institutions are available to all. They're usually available to everyone. Anyone can come in, anyone can have an opportunity to, grace the college seats, to actually go through the college door and try to enroll. A concern, though, when we speak about success, is about efficiency. Once you open the doors to all, which is an equity concern, then how do you graduate as many as possible using, resources in a good fashion? And that's always a trade-off for economists. We know that there's a trade-off between equity and efficiency. And whenever I hear talk about metrics and goals and completion, and we talk about them as if, we can achieve this without compromise in equity, I get worried. Because one of the easiest ways to ensure efficiency in graduation and success is to reduce access. So that's a concern. I'm not advocating that, of course, but I'm saying we need to ensure that whenever we set up metrics that work and look at efficiency and outcomes and measure success, then we are also on the same side looking at what happens to open enrollment, what is happening to people's access to the institutions. It's not your degree. It's not only your degree, but it's the type of major you choose, it's the type of occupation you choose. That matters. And whenever educators have a hard time dealing with data, as Jim told you earlier, you show them numbers that say, look, during this recession, most of the jobs lost were in jobs where people had a high school diploma or less, and most of the jobs gained were in jobs where people had a bachelor's degree or more. In fact, you are 3 times as likely to be unemployed if you have a high school diploma or less as if you have a bachelor's degree. Holders of bachelor's degree, unemployment rate is about 4.9%. But if you have a high school diploma or less, your unemployment rate is about 15%. If you're young, you're 5 times as unlikely to be unemployed. And young is defined as under 26. So educators have a hard time with data. They don't want to deal with data because they're so focused on dealing with anecdotes. Well, here's an anecdote. Love anecdotes too. My college roommate in undergrad, her major was art history. My major was in economics and mathematics. Any art history majors here? Before I go forward. So I was doing economics and math, and her major was in art history. And then, you know, for the most part, I was envious of her because she got to do so much fun stuff. And all I had was algebra, calculus, you know, these focus courses, combinatorics that you had to do, and there was very little leeway that we could move away from that. But upon graduation, I immediately went to a job at the central bank. And upon graduation, my roommate spent about 4 years trying to figure out where she was going to go. And eventually we landed together at a graduate program where I was doing my PhD in economics and she was doing her master's in economics. So my anecdote is intended to show I understand about finding yourself. I understand this notion. I mean, educators say it all the time. College is about finding yourself. You use the 4 years to go, you flail around, and you eventually end up. And you know what? This economy is very forgiving. Because if you were to look at the majors people take and the types of jobs they enter, they're not one-to-one. They're many-to-one. You might find people with art history majors who are working in STEM enterprises. You might find people who are physics workers who are working on Wall Street. I mean, physics students working on Wall Street. There's not necessarily any rule that says you have to land here. But I can tell you, it's much harder if you have no idea where you're going and you just land up. I mean, when you speak to those people afterwards and you say, well, how did you get here? You're like, oh, geez, had I known. Had I known. My roommate, by the way, she's now a manager at Accenture, so she's doing really well with her art history major. So if you were to interview her and you say, oh, look, she's an art history major, she's doing really well. And part of the anecdote is, well, what about those 4 years, the lost 4 years? So that conversation we don't want to have. Major matters. And I apologize for picking out art history, but it's just an anecdote. I could have just as easily picked psychology or social work. And here's the reason. Here's the reason. Another shameless plug. If you have the time, I want you to go on our website, cew.georgetown.edu, and I want you to look for a report called What's It Worth? What's It Worth? It's a report that takes 171 majors using the ACS data. Now, the ACS is an American Community Survey. It surveys 3 million individuals. Of those 3 million people, it looks at everybody's major. The first time they did it was 2010, and we've been able to use 2010 and do it by age. And it lines them up. And you have STEM and healthcare and all of that on the top, and you know what's at the bottom. You already know what's at the bottom. And again, this is not necessarily a normative thing for me saying this is what you ought to do, but this is what you ought to know. You ought to know that some types of degrees, if you are to earn a living wage, you need to go to grad school. You might need to go to get a graduate diploma. Another thing, women, let me get on the women. And I can say this because I'm female. Women. So I was making fun of psychology and art history and social work a moment ago. A lot of these traditionally female-dominated fields are also fields that have low wages. Teaching is one of them. It seems that whenever there are too many women, quote unquote, and that's more than 50%, whenever fields are female-dominated, the wages offered in those fields are lower. And that might be a value judgment, when these nurturing fields and that sort of thing. So you got to be very careful. If you plan to not graduate high school or graduate high school and don't go to post-secondary, you better be male. Because the only jobs that are still available to people with a high school diploma only who don't go to post-secondary, that still perhaps pays a fairly decent sustainable living wage, which I've defined as $35,000 a year and above, those are usually in the technical fields that are predominantly male-oriented or male-dominated, a lot more, 81% male, that sort of thing in those fields. So if you plan, I always say, well, yeah, I go to high schools all the time and speak to students every so often. Like, yeah, if you don't want to go to college, that's fine. You better be male. You better figure it out. There are gender change locations you might want to. Okay, I'll be done with the nonsense. But on a real level, those opportunities are only available now to males. So if you're a female, you need to get one additional degree to earn what a male one step beneath you earns. So a bachelor's degree female on average earns what an associate's degree male earns. A master's degree female earns on average what a bachelor's degree male earns. These are some realities. And this, we love to jump on the 76 cents to one and the discrimination, but it's also about choices, occupational choice. A lot of women choose these fields that pay lower wages. The example that I love to give is that when you look at the math programs or the graduation rate among math majors, female-dominated now. And this is my proxy for STEM. This is my proxy for STEM. Okay, you can do Algebra 2 and all that fun stuff. Yet once they graduate, what do? Do you go on to engineering? Once you graduate high school, you score in the top 10% of SATs. Where do the women end up? Teaching. Nothing's wrong with teaching. But if you end up teaching, then no, you're going to earn much less than if you pursued the STEM option. So, what's our march forward? Impact those at risk, strengthen pipelines, improve graduation rates, reduce need for remediation. I don't need to go through this. Stan has already done a wonderful job, and Jim about talking about this. I just wanted to talk about one thing that has been a little pet peeve for me, and I guess most people know about it, and I just want to mention it. Fisher versus the University of Texas at Austin. Ring a bell? Okay. So this is the Supreme Court case that should be decided by June, I think. I don't know. I guess whenever Roberts and they decide, that's when it's going to be available. But essentially, this young woman by the name of Fisher, who had applied to the University of Texas at Austin, felt that she was perhaps discriminated against because she did not obtain a placement in that school. And that's because in Texas, what they do is, in order for you to get access to the state schools, they take the top 10% of each region. Well, the top 10% of low-income region, if you're in the top 10% of your class and you're in a really low-income, depressed neighborhood, you can still possibly be lower than, someone else who was in the top 10% of a better placed region. The results of this ruling has great impact for access for minority populations. So I think if we are unable, Jim said earlier that high educated people or the high income people already do a really good job of graduating their own. There was a chart he gave about 79% versus 11% for those in the lowest income quartile. And this notion that University of Texas was actually trying to figure out, not necessarily by quotas, color quotas, but this was actually by area, location. If you live in this low-income neighborhood and you managed, against all odds, to get to the top 10% of your class, then you're going to have the ability to go college. My question is, what happens when we eliminate this? We already have situations where, if you were to look at schools in the United States, post-secondary institutions in the United States, you have the haves and the have-nots. We talk about community colleges. We speak about for-profits. One of the major arguments the for-profits made is we take the students nobody else wants. We take the non-traditional students. We spoke about the traditional student. The non-traditional student has become the traditional now. So our question is, I want us to pay attention to the big legislation as well and how that's going to impact and what happens with our access when we graduate this incoming cohort. We have to commit to good data. We have to engage stakeholders. Part of the advantage that community colleges have, I think, is this ability to connect to workforce. All of these boards that exist to ensure that students have the opportunity through apprenticeship programs and through internship programs, even before they graduate, to have that work experience. The community colleges have that advantage, and technical institutions have that advantage over traditional institutions. Commit to participation resources, and again, we have to determine effectiveness. I'm going to end by saying, if the objective here is to ensure that we better connect our supply, our graduates from our post-secondary institutions, we better connect them to the demands of the workforce, then there's a role for education, there's a role for industry, and there's a role for government, and all of these three panels are interconnected. I think we have very many examples of where we're actually doing a good job. The Chamber of Commerce is represented here. We can figure out how to ensure that industry and education connect, government through vision. The vision of a governor can take a state forward. And we've already seen that, we have set a goal of 250,000 graduates for Georgia. We need to make sure that once they graduate, they know exactly where they're going to go. They've made good decisions regarding what types of majors they select, and that they can in turn contribute to the overall economic success of Georgia 2020. So thank you all, and I hope I did not put too many people to sleep.